One day you'll pay for everything you've done to me.
They found my husband dead in his favorite armchair with a peaceful smile on his face and a half-empty coffee cup in his hands. The coroner said it was the most natural heart attack he'd ever seen. What he didn't know was that I had been killing Robert slowly, one morning coffee at a time, for 30 long years. And today I'm going to tell you exactly how I got away with the perfect murder. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. My name is Rose, and I've been a widow for 2 years now. Everyone in our small town of Millfield thinks I'm just a sweet old lady who lost her beloved husband to a tragic but natural death. They bring me casseroles, invite me to church socials, and tell me how lucky I was to have had such a wonderful marriage. If only they knew the truth. If only they knew that every single morning for 3 decades I carefully measured out tiny amounts of poison into Robert's coffee, watching him drink it down with a smile, never suspecting that his loving wife was slowly but surely ending his miserable life. You see, Robert Miller wasn't the man anyone thought he was. Behind closed doors, away from the charming smile he showed the world, he was a monster. And I, Rose Miller, was his favorite victim. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story, this 30-year journey to freedom, deserves to be told properly. I was 22 when I married Robert in 1965. He was 25 with coal-black hair, piercing blue eyes, and hands that could fix anything broken. All the girls in Millfield wanted him, but he chose me, Rose Thompson, the banker's daughter with mousy brown hair and a shy smile. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Our wedding was everything a small-town girl could dream of: white dress that cost more than my father made in 2 months, church bells ringing across the valley, and a reception that had the whole town talking for weeks. Looking back now, there were warning signs even during our courtship. The way Robert's jaw would clench when I talked to other men, even my own cousins. How he would grip my arm just a little too tightly when he walked me to my door. The possessive way he talked about our future together, like I was something he was acquiring rather than someone he was falling in love with. But I was young and naive, and I mistook his possessiveness for passion. The first time he hit me was on our honeymoon night. We were staying at this little cabin by Lake Harmony, about 50 miles outside of town. I had spent all day trying to be the perfect wife, unpacking our things, making the bed with the new sheets my mother had given us, and cooking his favorite meal on the tiny stove. I was wearing the beautiful blue nightgown my sister had bought me for my trousseau, and I thought I looked pretty for once in my life. But when I served dinner, the chicken was a little dry. Not burned, mind you, just not as juicy as his mother used to make. I had apologized and offered to cook something else, but Robert's face changed in an instant. The loving husband who had carried me over the threshold just hours before was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. The back of his hand came across my face so hard that I saw stars. The force of it knocked me clean off my feet, sending me sprawling across the kitchen floor of that romantic little cabin. I lay there, tasting blood in my mouth, staring up at this man I had promised to love, honor, and obey just hours before. "That's how my mother taught my father to train her," he said, standing over me with those cold blue eyes that no longer held any warmth. "A wife needs to know her place from day one. My mother never served my father a dry piece of chicken in 40 years of marriage." I should have run. I should have packed my bags that very night and gone back to my parents. But it was 1965, and divorced women were whispered about in our town. They were pitied at best, shunned at worst. Besides, he apologized so sweetly the next morning, bringing me wildflowers he'd picked by the lake, promising it would never happen again. He even cried real tears, saying he loved me more than life itself and that he didn't know what had come over him. "It's just that I want everything to be perfect for us," he said, stroking my bruised cheek with surprising gentleness. "You mean everything to me, Rose. I couldn't bear it if I disappointed you the way my father disappointed my mother." I forgave him because I wanted to believe in the man I had fallen in love with. I wanted to believe that marriage was just an adjustment period, that we would figure it out together. I convinced myself that maybe I really had been careless with dinner, that maybe I needed to try harder to be the wife he deserved. But it did happen again. 2 weeks later, when I forgot to starch his work shirts the way his mother had taught me. Then again when I burned the biscuits because I was distracted by a phone call from my sister. Then when I questioned him about coming home late 3 nights in a row, smelling like cheap perfume and cigarettes. Each time, Robert had a reason. Each time, it was my fault for not being the wife he needed me to be. Each time, he apologized afterward and promised it would never happen again if I just tried harder to meet his standards. The beatings became as regular as the sunrise. Robert had rules, you see. Dinner had to be on the table at exactly 6 o'clock every evening. His coffee had to be ready when he woke up at 5:30 every morning, made with exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar and a splash of cream. His clothes had to be pressed and laid out the night before with his socks rolled the way his mother had done it. The house had to be spotless at all times with fresh flowers on the table and the floors mopped twice a week. The lawn had to be perfect, not a blade of grass out of place. And I had to smile and act like the happiest woman in the world whenever we were in public. Any deviation from these rules resulted in punishment. A slap for minor infractions like leaving a water spot on a glass. A punch for moderate ones like being 5 minutes late with a meal. A full beating for major violations like talking back, crying where he could see me, or God forbid, threatening to leave. I learned to walk on eggshells, to anticipate his moods, to read the warning signs in his eyes. I became an expert at covering bruises with makeup, at explaining away black eyes with stories about walking into doors or falling down stairs. I practiced my lies in the mirror until they sounded natural. I learned which stores sold the best concealer, which hairstyles hid finger marks on my neck, which clothes covered the worst of the damage. The people in town either believed my lies or chose to look the other way. This was the 60s after all, and what happened between a man and his wife was considered private business. The few times someone noticed something, like when Mrs. Henderson from next door asked about a particularly bad bruise on my arm, I would laugh it off and change the subject. Women didn't talk about these things back then. We suffered in silence and counted ourselves lucky if we had a roof over our heads and food on the table. For the first 5 years of our marriage, I lived in constant fear. I jumped every time he walked through the door, trying to read his mood from the sound of his footsteps. I flinched when he raised his hand, even if it was just to scratch his head or reach for something on a high shelf. I slept with one eye open, never knowing what might set him off in the middle of the night. Sometimes it was a dream about work stress, sometimes it was just the fact that I was taking up too much space in the bed. I tried everything I could think of to be a better wife. I took cooking classes from his mother, who was a cold woman that clearly thought I wasn't good enough for her precious son. I read every housekeeping magazine I could get my hands on. I practiced walking more quietly, speaking more softly, anticipating his needs before he had to ask for anything. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. There was always something wrong, always some way I had failed to meet his impossible standards. The isolation was almost worse than the physical abuse. Robert systematically cut me off from my family and friends, always with reasonable-sounding excuses. My sister called too much and was a bad influence. My parents were too old-fashioned and didn't understand modern marriage. My friends from high school were jealous of my happiness and trying to cause trouble. One by one, I lost touch with everyone who had ever cared about me until Robert was the only person left in my world. But something changed in 1970. Maybe it was turning 27 and realizing I was still young enough to have a whole life ahead of me. Maybe it was watching my neighbor, Betty, leave her abusive husband and start over in the city with nothing but a suitcase and her 2 young children. Or maybe it was the day Robert beat me so badly that I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days, and I realized that if I didn't do something, he was going to kill me eventually anyway. I remember lying in that bed, my ribs aching with every breath, my face so swollen I could barely see out of my left eye, and suddenly I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. Angrier than I had ever been in my entire life. I was angry at Robert for what he had done to me, angry at myself for letting it happen, angry at a world that expected women to endure anything for the sake of marriage. And in that anger, I found something I hadn't felt in years: determination. That's when I started planning. I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't just shoot him or stab him in his sleep. In a town like Millfield, that kind of thing would be investigated thoroughly. The wife is always the first suspect, and I had no doubt that someone would eventually put together the pieces about our troubled marriage. Even though I had hidden it well, there had to be people who suspected something wasn't right in our perfect little home. No, I needed something subtle, something that would look completely natural, something that would take time so there would be no connection between cause and effect. I needed a method that would allow me to continue playing the devoted wife while slowly, carefully, systematically ending the nightmare my life had become. That's when I remembered my grandmother's stories about the old country, about women who dealt with unwanted husbands using methods passed down through generations. Grandmother O'Brien had immigrated from Ireland when she was just 16, and she used to tell me these tales when I was little, calling them fairy stories about clever women who outwitted cruel men. At the time, I thought they were just entertaining stories, but now I understood they were something else entirely. They were survival guides passed down from mother to daughter in whispered conversations over cups of tea. I started researching at the library in the next town over, telling the librarian I was writing a mystery novel and needed information about various poisons for authenticity. She was delighted to help, pulling books about toxicology, forensic science, and criminal investigation methods. I spent hours reading about substances that could mimic natural diseases, about the difference between acute and chronic poisoning, about detection methods and autopsy procedures. I learned about arsenic, which had been the poison of choice for generations of murderous spouses, but which was becoming easier to detect with modern testing methods. I read about plant-based toxins, some of which were virtually undetectable even with sophisticated equipment. I studied the symptoms of various heart conditions, learning to recognize the signs of cardiac distress and the progression of heart disease. The substance I chose was perfect for my needs. It occurred naturally in certain plants that could be grown in any garden, was virtually undetectable in small doses, and when administered over a long period of time would cause symptoms that looked exactly like progressive heart disease. The beauty of it was that Robert was already a prime candidate for cardiac problems. He was overweight, smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, drank heavily on weekends, and had a family history of heart disease. His father had died of a heart attack at 58, and his grandfather had suffered multiple cardiac events before dying at 62. When the time came, nobody would question a heart attack. It would be tragic but not surprising. Getting my hands on the substance was easier than you might think. I started a little herb garden in our backyard, telling Robert I wanted to grow our own seasonings to save money. He actually praised me for being thrifty and taking initiative to help with household expenses. If only he knew what I was really cultivating back there among the tomatoes, basil, and rosemary. The plant I needed grew wild in many areas, but I wanted to control the quality and potency of what I was harvesting. I ordered seeds through a catalog, claiming I was interested in historical gardening and wanted to grow plants that colonial women would have used for medicinal purposes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using traditional women's knowledge to solve a very modern problem. I spent months learning how to properly harvest, dry, and process the plant material. I experimented with different extraction methods, testing the potency on mice I trapped in our basement. I know that sounds cruel, but I had to be absolutely certain of the dosage. Too little and Robert would just feel slightly unwell. Too much and he might die suddenly, which would raise suspicions. I needed something that would work slowly and steadily over a period of years. The first time I put it in his coffee, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the cup. It was a Tuesday morning in November 1971, exactly 6 years after our wedding day. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I had decided that my real marriage, my marriage to freedom, would begin on the anniversary of the day my nightmare started. It was just a tiny amount, barely visible to the naked eye, mixed into his usual morning brew with cream and 2 sugars. I had ground it into an extremely fine powder and mixed it with a small amount of instant coffee to help it dissolve completely. Robert came down to breakfast at exactly 6 o'clock, as he had every morning for 6 years. He was grumpy because it was Monday and he hated his job at the auto parts factory, which meant he was more likely to find fault with something I had done. But that morning, everything was perfect. His eggs were cooked exactly right, his toast was golden brown, and his coffee was hot and fresh. He drank it down like always, reading his newspaper and complaining about the weather, never suspecting that his loving wife had just administered the first dose of his very slow, very certain death sentence. Nothing happened that day or the next or even that week. That was the point. I was playing the longest game imaginable and I had to be patient. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. I had taken action. I was no longer just a victim waiting for the next beating. I was fighting back, even if Robert would never know it. I developed a routine that became as natural as breathing. Every morning, I would wake up at 5:15, 15 minutes before Robert's alarm went off. I would go to the kitchen, start the coffee, and while it was brewing, I would carefully measure out his daily dose from the small vial I kept hidden behind the flour canister. The amount was so small that it fit on the tip of a teaspoon and it dissolved completely in the hot coffee, leaving no trace of its presence. The hardest part wasn't the poisoning itself. It was acting normal, continuing to be the dutiful wife while secretly orchestrating his demise. Smiling when he complimented my coffee, which he did more and more often as time went on. Thanking him when he told me I was finally learning to make it just the way he liked it, strong and hot with just the right amount of sweetness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Robert had spent years training me to be the perfect wife. using violence and intimidation to mold me into exactly what he wanted. Now I was using those very skills, that perfect facade of domestic devotion, to kill him. Every smile, every yes dear, every perfectly prepared meal was part of my revenge. I had become exactly what he wanted, a wife who anticipated his every need and served him without question. He just never suspected that one of his needs I was fulfilling was his need to die. The psychological complexity of what I was doing sometimes overwhelmed me. During the day, I would tend to his needs with apparent devotion, listening to his complaints about work, massaging his shoulders when he claimed to be stressed, even initiating intimacy when I sensed he was growing suspicious of my emotional distance. But at night, lying next to him in the dark, I would think about the poison working its way through his system, slowly weakening his heart, slowly bringing me closer to freedom. After about 6 months, he started complaining about feeling tired. Nothing dramatic, just mentioning that he didn't seem to have as much energy as he used to. I played the concerned wife perfectly, suggesting he see a doctor, but also pointing out that he was working long hours and maybe just needed more rest. I started making him heavier dinners, encouraging him to relax more in the evenings, creating the perfect cover story for why he might be feeling run down. After a year, he started mentioning occasional chest pains, brief twinges that came and went, usually after physical exertion or stress. Again, I expressed concern but also pointed out that his father had started having heart problems around the same age. It was probably genetic, I suggested. Maybe he should cut back on the cigarettes and try to lose a little weight. By year 2, the symptoms were becoming more noticeable. He was having trouble sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night with his heart racing. He felt short of breath sometimes, especially when climbing stairs or working in the yard. His complexion was starting to look grayish, and he complained of frequent heartburn. I suggested he see Dr. Harrison, our family physician, but I also made sure to mention all of Robert's lifestyle factors and family history. I planted the seeds of a natural explanation for his symptoms, so that when he finally did seek medical attention, the doctor would already be predisposed to think in terms of inherited heart disease rather than external causes. When Robert finally went for his checkup, Dr. Harrison found exactly what I had hoped he would find: elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and signs of early cardiac stress. But all of these symptoms were consistent with Robert's risk factors. The doctor prescribed some mild medication and advised him to quit smoking, lose weight, and reduce stress, advice that Robert largely ignored. I played the concerned wife perfectly throughout this period. I researched heart-healthy recipes and started cooking with less salt and fat. I suggested we take evening walks together, ostensibly for his health but really so I could monitor his condition and make sure the poisoning was progressing as planned. I even convinced him to join me for couples activities at church, telling him that spiritual wellness was just as important as physical health. The beautiful thing about my method was that it created a feedback loop. As Robert's health deteriorated, he became more irritable and unpredictable. He was still hitting me, but now he was also increasingly paranoid and confused. The worse he felt physically, the more he lashed out emotionally. And the more he hurt me, the more motivated I became to continue with my plan. During year 3, he started having genuine heart palpitations that would last for minutes at a time. His hands would shake and he would break out in cold sweats. Year 4 brought dizzy spells that sometimes caused him to stumble or lose his balance. By year 5, he was having chest pains that were strong enough to double him over and leave him gasping for breath. Each escalation in symptoms brought another visit to Dr. Harrison, and each visit reinforced the narrative of progressive heart disease. The doctor adjusted his medications, prescribed new treatments, and continued to advise lifestyle changes that Robert continued to ignore. I was there for every appointment, taking notes on the doctor's recommendations, asking intelligent questions about treatment options, and generally appearing to be the devoted wife of a man struggling with serious health issues. What nobody knew was that I was controlling every aspect of his decline. When I wanted his symptoms to worsen, I would increase his daily dose slightly. When I needed him to have a few good days so that his condition wouldn't progress too rapidly, I would reduce the amount or even skip a day entirely. I became an expert at reading his body's responses and adjusting accordingly. The psychological toll of what I was doing was enormous. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was becoming a monster myself. Was I any better than Robert? He used his fists to hurt me, but I was using something far more insidious and calculated. At least his violence was honest and straightforward, born of anger and poor impulse control. Mine was cold, calculated, and sustained over years of careful planning. But then he would have another episode, another night where he beat me for some imagined slight, and I would remember why I was doing this. I was killing him before he killed me. It was self-defense, just spread out over decades instead of moments. Every bruise on my body was justification for what I was doing. Every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment of fear was payment toward the debt he would eventually settle with his life. By year 10, Robert was on multiple heart medications and had been officially diagnosed with progressive cardiovascular disease. Dr. Harrison had referred him to a cardiologist in the city, who confirmed the diagnosis and warned that Robert was at high risk for a major cardiac event. The specialist recommended more aggressive treatment and stricter lifestyle modifications, but by this point, Robert was too set in his ways to make significant changes. The irony was that Robert used his medical condition as an excuse to be even more demanding and abusive at home. "The stress of dealing with you is probably what's making me sick," he would tell me whenever I failed to meet his increasingly impossible standards. The beating that followed those accusations were particularly vicious, as if he was trying to literally beat the life out of me the way I was slowly draining it from him. It was after one such beating, when I was left with 2 cracked ribs and a black eye that took 3 weeks to fully heal, that I decided to accelerate the timeline. Robert was getting sicker, but he was also getting more dangerous. His declining health made him unpredictable, and I was afraid that one day he might lose control completely and actually kill me before my plan could reach its conclusion. That night, as I lay in bed listening to him snore beside me, I doubled his daily dose. It was a calculated risk. Too much of an increase might cause a sudden cardiac event that could seem suspicious. But I had been monitoring his condition for a decade, and I believed his system could handle the increase while still maintaining the appearance of natural disease progression. Years 15 through 20 were the most dangerous for me, both physically and legally. Robert's health was declining noticeably now, but he was still strong enough to hurt me badly when the mood struck him. At the same time, I had to be extremely careful not to accelerate the process too quickly. Any sudden change in his condition might raise suspicions, especially if someone decided to do a more thorough investigation of his death. I became a student of his body, learning to read the signs of his deteriorating health like a farmer reads the weather. I knew when his blood pressure was spiking by the way he rubbed his temples. I could predict heart palpitations by changes in his skin color and breathing patterns. I knew when to increase the dose slightly and when to back off to avoid pushing him over the edge too quickly. During this period, I also had to deal with his growing paranoia and mental confusion. The sustained poisoning was affecting his brain as well as his heart, causing mood swings, memory problems, and irrational suspicions. Fortunately for me, his paranoia focused on his coworkers and neighbors rather than his devoted wife who brought him coffee every morning with such loving care. He became convinced that his boss was trying to force him into early retirement. He suspected the neighbors of spying on us and reporting our business to others in town. He even accused Dr. Harrison of overprescribing medications as part of some conspiracy to keep him sick. But through it all, I remained his one constant source of comfort and support, the only person he still trusted completely. Year 21 brought the first major heart attack. I found him collapsed in the garage on a Saturday morning, clutching his chest and gasping for air. For a moment, I thought this might be it, that my 30-year plan was finally reaching its conclusion. But then training kicked in and I called the ambulance immediately, performed CPR according to the techniques I had learned in the first aid class I had taken specifically for this situation, and rode with him to the hospital while holding his hand and whispering words of encouragement. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. The damage to his heart was significant and he would need to be much more careful about his health going forward. They put him on stronger medications, prescribed a strict diet and exercise regimen, and told him that another attack might very well be fatal. The cardiologist was amazed that Robert had survived such a massive cardiac event, and he credited my quick action and first aid knowledge with saving my husband's life. If only he knew that I had also been the one slowly destroying it for 2 decades. When we got home from the hospital, Robert was a changed man for a brief time. The near-death experience had scared him more than anything ever had, and for a few months he was actually almost kind to me. He stopped hitting me entirely and even said please and thank you when I served his meals. He talked about wanting to make the most of whatever time he had left, about being grateful for my devotion and care. I'll admit, I wavered during this period. I actually considered stopping the poisoning and trying to build some kind of real relationship with this suddenly vulnerable man. Maybe we could have counseling. Maybe he could genuinely change. Maybe there was still hope for us to have some kind of normal marriage in whatever years remained to us. But old habits die hard, and Robert's brief period of kindness didn't last long. As he recovered his strength, his old patterns reasserted themselves. By month 4 of his recovery, he was back to his old ways of criticism, control, and violence. The first time he hit me after the heart attack, I knew I had been foolish to hope for change. Leopards don't change their spots, and abusive husbands don't become loving partners just because they've had a brush with death. The only difference now was that I knew the end was coming soon. His damaged heart couldn't take much more stress, and my careful poisoning had weakened it beyond repair. I just needed to be patient a little longer. I continued with the daily doses, but I also started preparing for the aftermath in earnest. I practiced my grief responses in front of the mirror, perfecting the balance between devastated widow and woman trying to be strong in the face of tragedy. I planned what I would say to the doctors, to the neighbors, to the pastor, to anyone who might ask questions about Robert's final days. I rehearsed being the devoted wife who had done everything possible to save her beloved husband. I prepared stories about how hard I had tried to get him to follow the doctor's orders, how worried I had been about his health, how much I would miss our life together. I even wrote drafts of the eulogy I might be asked to give, painting a picture of a loving marriage that no one would question. Years 25 through 29 were a careful waiting game. Robert's health continued to decline steadily despite the best medical care available. He was on multiple heart medications now, used an oxygen tank at night to help with his breathing, and had difficulty walking more than a few blocks without becoming winded. He looked every one of his 60-plus years and more, his face gray and drawn, his body bent with the weight of his failing health. People started commenting on how devoted I was, caring for such a sick husband with such grace and patience. Church ladies would stop me at the grocery store to tell me how inspiring my dedication was, how lucky Robert was to have such a loving wife. The pastor mentioned our marriage as an example of true commitment during one of his sermons about the sanctity of wedding vows. If only they knew that I was the reason Robert was sick in the first place. If only they knew that every act of care and devotion was a performance designed to cover up 3 decades of systematic murder. The morning of day number 10,950 started like any other morning in our routine. I woke up at 5:15 as I had every day for 30 years and made my way to the kitchen to start the coffee. But something felt different that day. Call it intuition, call it hope, but I had a feeling that this might be the day I had been working toward for 3 decades. I prepared Robert's coffee with extra care that morning, measuring out what I somehow knew would be his final dose. The poison had accumulated in his system to dangerous levels by now, and his weakened heart was hanging on by a thread. It would take very little to push him over the edge. Robert came down for breakfast at exactly 6 o'clock as he had every morning for 30 years. He was moving more slowly than usual, and I noticed he was slightly short of breath just from walking down the stairs. His color was particularly bad that morning, with a grayish pallor that I had learned to recognize as a sign of severe cardiac stress. "Coffee smells good this morning," he said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table with obvious effort. "I made it extra strong just the way you like it," I replied, setting the cup in front of him with hands that were finally, after 3 decades, completely steady. He took a long sip and smiled, a genuine smile that reminded me briefly of the young man I had fallen in love with 40 years earlier. "Perfect, as always. I don't know what I'd do without you, Rose." "You'll never have to find out," I said, and I meant it. Death would part us soon enough. We sat in comfortable silence while he read the morning paper and I pretended to do the crossword puzzle. In reality, I was watching his every movement, looking for signs that today might be different from all the other days. I was memorizing this moment, the last normal breakfast we would ever share, the final act in a drama that had consumed half my life. About halfway through his second cup of coffee, Robert started rubbing his chest absently. Nothing unusual there, he had been having chest discomfort for years. But then he set down his cup with shaking hands and leaned back in his chair with a strange expression on his face. "Rose," he said quietly, and I could hear something different in his voice. "I don't feel quite right." I was on my feet immediately, switching seamlessly into the role I had been rehearsing for years. "What's wrong, honey? Should I call Dr. Harrison?" "Maybe you should," he said, and I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. My chest feels really tight and my left arm is going numb. I made the call, describing Robert's symptoms to the receptionist and asking if we should come in immediately or go straight to the emergency room. The receptionist, who knew us well after years of cardiac episodes, told me to call 911 right away. While I was on the phone, I heard a thud from the kitchen. Robert had collapsed. I hung up and rushed to his side, checking for a pulse like I had learned in the first aid class I had taken years earlier specifically for this moment. His heart was beating, but irregularly and weakly, and his breathing was shallow and labored. I called 911 and then knelt beside my husband of 30 years, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort while we waited for the ambulance. Part of me felt genuine sadness in that moment, not for the man Robert had become, but for the man he might have been if he had chosen a different path. 30 years is a long time to spend with someone, even under the worst circumstances, and there had been a few good moments scattered among all the terrible ones. There had been quiet Sunday mornings when he was in a good mood, holidays when he almost seemed like a normal husband, brief glimpses of the person I had thought I was marrying. But those moments had been far outweighed by decades of fear, pain, and systematic abuse. As I held his hand and watched him struggle for breath, I felt no guilt about what I had done, only a profound sense of relief that it was finally over. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Robert before transporting him to the hospital. I rode with them, playing the terrified wife, begging them to save my husband, asking if there was anything I could do to help. The lead paramedic, a kind man named Tom who had responded to several of Robert's previous cardiac episodes, assured me that they were doing everything possible. At the hospital, I waited in the family room while the doctors worked on Robert. Other families were there too, dealing with their own medical emergencies, and I found myself genuinely comforting a young woman whose father had been in a car accident. It felt strange to be offering real comfort while secretly hoping for the worst possible news about my own husband. Dr. Palmer, the emergency room physician, came out after about an hour and a half. I could tell from his expression that the news wasn't good, and I prepared myself to receive it with the appropriate level of devastation. "Mrs. Miller," he said gently, taking my hands in his, "I'm so very sorry. Your husband suffered a massive heart attack. We did everything we could, but the damage was too extensive. He passed away peacefully about 10 minutes ago." I collapsed into his arms, sobbing with what everyone assumed was grief but was actually relief so profound I could barely breathe. 30 years of planning, 30 years of daily doses, 30 years of playing the perfect wife while slowly killing my abuser, and it was finally over. I was free. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and condolences. I called Robert's brother, our pastor, and a few close neighbors to share the sad news. Everyone was shocked but not entirely surprised. Robert's heart problems had been getting worse for years, and everyone knew that another major attack could be fatal. The funeral arrangements took several days to finalize, and during that time I received more casseroles, flowers, and expressions of sympathy than I knew what to do with. The entire town seemed to rally around the grieving widow, offering help with everything from grocery shopping to lawn care. If any of them had known what Robert was really like behind closed doors, they never let on. The funeral was everything Robert would have wanted. Half the town showed up to pay their respects to a man they thought they knew. The pastor spoke eloquently about Robert's devotion to family and community. His co-workers shared stories about his work ethic and reliability. His brother gave a moving eulogy about what a good husband and provider he had been, how much he had loved his wife, and how their marriage had been an inspiration to everyone who knew them. I sat in the front pew, dressed in black, accepting condolences from people who had no idea what kind of man we were really burying. Several women told me how lucky I had been to have such a wonderful marriage, how they hoped their own husbands would be half as devoted as Robert had been. If only they knew that I had spent the last 30 years of that wonderful marriage slowly murdering my husband one coffee cup at a time. The investigation, such as it was, lasted all of 2 days. The coroner ruled Robert's death a natural cardiac event, entirely consistent with his medical history and family background. Given his documented heart disease, his family history, and his lifestyle factors, there was no reason to suspect foul play. The life insurance company paid out without question. The police never even spoke to me except to offer their condolences and ask if I needed any help with home security now that I was living alone. In the 2 years since Robert's death, I have lived more freely than I had since I was 22 years old. I sleep through the night without fear, something I hadn't done in decades. I eat what I want when I want without worrying about whether it meets someone else's standards. I've made new friends, joined clubs, taken up hobbies I had always wanted to try. I even started dating a lovely widower named Frank who treats me like a queen and can't believe that any man would ever raise a hand to a woman. Sometimes people ask me if I miss Robert, and I always say yes because that's what widows are supposed to say. What they don't understand is that I do miss him in a strange way. I miss having a purpose, a long-term project, something that gave structure and meaning to my days. Killing Robert slowly and carefully for 30 years was the most challenging thing I've ever done, and there's a strange sort of pride that comes with having executed such a complex plan flawlessly. I've never told anyone the truth about what I did, and I never will. As far as the world is concerned, Rose Miller is just a sweet old widow who lost her husband to heart disease after a long and happy marriage. But sometimes when I'm making my morning coffee in my peaceful kitchen, I think about those 3 decades of careful planning and patient execution, and I smile. You see, Robert taught me to be the perfect wife. He spent years training me, using violence and intimidation to mold me into exactly what he wanted. He just never realized that the perfect wife for an abusive husband is one who knows how to make the perfect cup of coffee, with just a little something extra to help him along to his final rest. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I disagree. I think revenge is best served hot, in a coffee cup, every single morning for 30 years until the job is finally done. And when it's over, when justice has finally been served, you sit back and enjoy the rest of your life knowing that you never have to be afraid again. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Rose's 30-year plan in the comments below. Was she justified in what she did, or did she become the very monster she was trying to escape? Do you think there were other options she could have pursued, or was this her only path to freedom? For more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat and make you question everything you think you know about the people around you, click on the suggested video that should be appearing on your screen right now.